About 17 years ago, a group of people got together and said, we want to start a different church. Not another church, because this area and most areas have enough churches. What we want to do is a different church, the kind of church where you don't have to have previous church experience to come and be part of it. You don't have to even like church to want to come and be part of this church. And that's how Great Lakes was born. It was that thing. We were going to put helping people find and follow Jesus above anything else, above what we normally did or what everybody was used to, so that it was accessible to everyone. And a couple months ago, fast forward those 17 years, we took a survey and we asked all of GLC if they had gone to another church before they came to Great Lakes Church. 43% of you said no. I had no prior church experience when I came to Great Lakes. That means in your row, 4 out of 10 of you would say, this was my first church, it's my only church. And then some more of you would say, I used to go to church, I gave up on church, and then I came back to this one because it was different from that church. With that many people in the room that don't have any prior church experience, I thought it might be helpful to share with you my prior church experience. Because I grew up in this baby, not this one, but the church thing. I mean, I went every Sunday without fail, both services in the morning, and then we had an evening service that was different than the morning service. It was expected that you go to that one as well. And then there was a midweek one, which was yet a different service, and so it was expected that you went to that one as well. And then we'd put an event on Friday probably and end up needing to be there for that. I mean, we lived at the church. And there were expectations that came with that church. And you are maybe going to feel like this sounds familiar because you grew up in one like I did. I had special clothes. They were my Sunday best. I was not allowed to wear those clothes to school. I was not allowed to play outside in those clothes. In fact, I only wore them once a week for a couple hours. They were special. And we went into a special place when we would go to church. We didn't call it an auditorium back then. We called it a sanctuary. And the sanctuary was very, very holy, so you needed to be very, very behaved when you were in there. You better sit up straight. And by the way, we didn't sit on comfortable seats. We sat on these things called pews. And by the way, some of those rooms would make you say, pew, it doesn't smell right in here. But we'd sit in these pews and we'd sing out of books. There weren't screens or any of that kind of stuff. We were not allowed to bring beverages into the sanctuary. We were not allowed to eat in the sanctuary. This was like an other than place. And you talked in a certain way, so when you prayed, you would use big words that you might not normally use in a conversation, because we talk to God differently than we talk to people. And it was this thing that eventually made me wonder if it mattered. It made me wonder, is it relevant? Are we just all playing games around here? In fact, a lot of my friends, that was the reason they left church. They stopped going altogether. They were tired of, my dad actually wore a suit every Sunday. We had to tuck in a shirt, and nice pants, nice shirt. I remember singing these songs. You think our songs are long. Some of the songs we sang back in the day, it was like, I don't even know what any of this means, but we're just singing and singing and singing, right? And the pastor would get up and talk, and forever. I know I go long-winded sometimes, but these were long talks, and you're going, I don't know how this connects to my life. And so my friends, a lot of them decided it doesn't, and I'm not going anymore. Which makes me so grateful for a church that does it different. Because a lot of my friends have come back to churches like Great Lakes. Because so much of that has been removed, and that's made a lot of people uneasy. And I know that some of us might even say we miss some of it. And what I'm not going to do for the next while is bash that old kind of way of doing church. I'm not. I grew up in it and I appreciate it. But what I want to make sure we understand is what Jesus came and started. Because what Jesus started was different than what everybody thought was religion. In fact, it was the religious people that had the biggest problem with Jesus. It was the religious people that would actually go so far as to say his life needs to be over. Because I think Jesus started a movement of people, a lot like Great Lakes, that would say, you can come as you are. You can come all tangled up and messed up, lots of doubts, lots of questions, imperfect. In fact, if you were having a real good time last night, you can still come to church today. We're going to give you coffee to help you get past that, right? Like, my friends needed a church like this. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be all squared up and have it figured out and all the right clothes. I mean, aren't you so glad that COVID introduced us to athleisure wear? I mean, the only time I wear a tie anymore, I had to wear one last night because I went to one of our local partners' gala, and when my friends saw me, I was talking to them on a video call. They're like, "Are you doing a funeral tonight?" What? Because that's the only time I dress up anymore, and I'm not complaining about that. But what we need to understand for a lot of people is it's a huge change. It's a huge change. And to some people, it feels like, and this is actually a label that has been put on Great Lakes. And I'm not telling you this to make you mad, and we don't need you to go on social media and defend or anything like that. But sometimes we get called church light because it can't be serious if we're not doing some of those things. We can't be all about Jesus and God and our faith if we aren't doing it the way it has always been done. You see, the problem is for so many people that it feels like a loss because the foundation of the institution is cracking in their minds. And they look at somebody like me and maybe even you and they go, it feels a little irresponsible what you're doing. It feels like you're not taking it seriously. I mean, you do have these big rock songs that people clap and cheer to, and you're drinking coffee, and you don't even, it's an auditorium. Like we changed the language a little bit, and it just feels like the thing that's been around for so long is being broken in their mind. There's a sense of loss. Change is the reason so many of us hate it is because it feels like we're losing something. And I want you to know, if you grew up in the church and you feel that, I get that. Because I grew up in the church too, and it's different. But it's different in a good way. And I actually think the thing that we're feeling like we're losing is something that never should have been bolted on in the first place. That we're not actually losing something we should grieve losing. So, if you're here today, even if you've been coming for a long time or this is your first week and you have struggled with organized religion, the thing that has kept you away from here for so long is this like religious thing that everybody gets into, and there's rights and wrongs and do's and don'ts and rules and regulations and there's services and all that. This series that we're calling Unstitutional is for you. Because the thing that you're used to, the thing that you walked away from, the thing you gave up on, the thing that maybe still today really, really frustrates you, it's not the movement that Jesus started. And what I want to do for the next few weeks is get back to what did Jesus actually start? What is the thing that you and I are or considering being part of? Because it looks different than maybe what we're used to. So you need to know right out of the gate, right when we start this series, and for the next few weeks, I'm going to try to do my best to show you that Jesus started a new model, not a remodel. Jesus started a new thing. He didn't adjust an old thing. You could think of it like this. When Jesus arrived, he did not come into the house of religion and start moving furniture around so that it was more feng shui. He didn't come in and start adjusting pictures and changing pillows on couches and stuff so that people would be more comfortable. He started kicking down doors and knocking down walls. He was doing a whole new thing. And to people that were religious in the first century, it made him a rebel. It made him a problem. It's why eventually they decided he needed to be eliminated. But religious people were not the only people that had an issue with what Jesus was doing. The Roman Empire itself, the occupying power of Israel, had a real issue with it too, even after Jesus was on earth, because his followers were talking crazy. Now, if you remember back to your history books, or if you've ever taken like a history of Christianity or anything like that, you know that in the middle of the first century, a guy named Nero was the emperor of Rome. Nero was a bad dude. If ever anybody has been evil incarnate, it was this guy. He cared about one thing and one thing only: power. Unlimited, unchallenged power. And so he was kind of the main guy. There were a lot of emperors that persecuted Christians. And by the way, in America, we don't know what persecution is as Christians, because this is what persecution was in the first century in the Middle East when Rome was occupying it. They would find Christians because it was illegal to be one, and then they would say, if you want to be like your Christ so much, we'll kill you like we killed him. And they would put Christians on crosses, left and right. You would walk down streets and there would be Christians hanging and dying on crosses, because they were sending the message, don't mess with us. More so, don't mess with Caesar. Nero also instituted this practice of being torn apart by animals. He would put Christians in kind of like an arena sort of thing, and he'd let wild animals come and just shred them. He loved what he called human torches. Before the comic book character came to be, he would literally burn Christians at the stake. Now, here's what's so interesting. The reason he did all those things is not the reason that so many people dislike Christians today. Nero didn't persecute Christians because they were judgmental. That was not part of the equation. He didn't persecute Christians because they were exclusive, saying that their God was the only God. He didn't even persecute Christians because they were conservatives. He persecuted Christians because of what they believed about a person. Because Christians walked around saying this: Caesar isn't our king. Jesus is. The reason the Roman Empire went after Christians in the first century was because they believed that Jesus was God and that Jesus was in charge, not Nero, and not the emperor after him, and not the emperor after him. And that's why they were persecuted. Can you imagine if in the 21st century, in this amazing free country in which we live, the only thing people disliked about Christians was that they believed Jesus was God? Can you imagine that? Here's what I think would happen. A lot of employers would say, I don't believe that Jesus is God, but I want Christians on my team. I hope the people, because they are people of integrity, they are honest, they work hard, they are kind to their coworkers, they're team players, they look to serve other people. Yeah, I don't believe the Jesus thing, but they're great. It might look like moms and dads saying, I hope my son marries a Christian girl. I hope my daughter marries a Christian guy, right? Like, because they are going to love my child well. They're going to love my child selflessly. Yeah, but they believe Jesus is God. Let them believe that. That's come with a whole lot of good in those people. I mean, just imagine for a second if that was the world in which we lived. The only thing people disliked about us is that we believed Jesus was God. The problem is we don't do it how the first century Christians did it. We keep gravitating, and by we, I'll say me, because maybe you do this different. I gravitate backwards to what I'm going to call the temple model. The temple model was the predominant model of religion, not just in the first century, but all the centuries before. It was instituted by God. And here's how the temple model works. A holy place with holy texts that only holy men know how to read. You're like, I grew up in that temple, right? And by the way, there's usually heated adherents to that religion. I don't know why, but they're always angry. And actually, some of the Christians we know today, they're just angry. And you're like, why are you angry? And you're like, because I love Jesus. I'm like, what? Doesn't make sense. Right? But we grow up in a church that feels like a holy place. And it has this holy text. We call it the Bible. And the Bible's really complicated, and it's really scary. And you need a guide to explain it to you. I don't need to read it myself. I just need to go to the place so the guy can say something about it. And some of you are sitting here going, that's kind of what this is, right? Somewhat. I mean, I know some of the bones are the same, but you need to meet me if you think I'm holy, because I ain't nothing like that. And if you think this place is holy, just know that at various times there are dodgeballs being thrown around in this room. We don't see it that way. There is some model to it that we still follow, but we've gotten away from the bottom line message of the temple model. Because when you have a holy place with holy text that only holy men can interpret and explain, here's what they're saying. That's all holy, and you are not. That place, that thing, that person, they are godly, you're not. You need to get close to them and be around them, so maybe by osmosis some of their holiness will hit you. So go to church every week. Follow the rules. Some of you, the reason you walked away from religion is because you kind of came to this conclusion. It's just there to control people. It's just there to get people to behave. For a while, maybe you were right. But I want you to know what Jesus started was not Temple 2.0. Because what Jesus started was a whole new model, not a remodel. He was not coming into the temple and saying, we'll just make it more comfortable for people. We'll make it a little easier to walk in the door. No, he started knocking down walls, and that's what people had trouble with. Now, for you and I, part of the reason we constantly feel pulled back to that, I had somebody in the lobby, we were talking, and they said a cuss word, and they were like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm in church. I'm like, that's totally okay. Wait till you hear this talk, because we're going to mess all that up. Because there's a single word that's been introduced to our vocabulary that sends us backwards to the temple over and over and over again. And it got introduced in the Bible, and most people assume that Jesus introduced it. I'm going to change your mind. Here we go. In Matthew 16, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist. John's head had been chopped off and he had died, and so some people thought Jesus was him come back. Some say Elijah, the great prophet that we know from the Old Testament. And others say Jeremiah, another prophet from the Old Testament, or one of the other prophets. We just probably think you're back from somewhere else. Then he asked them, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, or the Lord, or the King, or the chosen one, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, you are blessed, or you are right. Good answer. That's who I am. Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you, you did not learn this from any human being. Now, I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build, here's the word, my church. And all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Here's the problem. Jesus didn't say church. If you don't know this, the New Testament, where we're reading from, in Matthew in this case, is written in Greek. And it's kind of written, and that's not necessarily the language Jesus said it in. He may have said it in Aramaic at the time. And we have translated, it's true, sometimes translations get a little funky, and this is one of those places. Because when English writers sat down to put this down for us, they were like, we don't have a word for that word that Jesus said. So a good German person came along and said, just use the word church. Because church means house of the Lord. Now, if you grew up going to church, you might have been told by your parents, hey, get your Sunday best on because we're going to God's house today. You might remember walking into a service like this and a singer comes out and go, welcome to God's house. We're so glad that you're here. Now behave. Be careful because God is watching, right? Like that's kind of the vibe. And we always associate church with a building because of that, a house, which makes us think of the temple. It is a holy place with holy people and holy texts. And I'm not holy, so I can't go there. This is why people say things like, oh man, if I walk through the door of a church, the place would light on fire. Because they see it as so other than them. But Jesus didn't say church. Jesus said ecclesia. And ecclesia means gathering of people. The thing that Jesus was starting when he said, I'm going to build what we say church, he was saying, I'm going to build a gathering of people that will follow me and behave like me and mimic me, and they are going to change the world, and there is nothing that will be able to stop that gathering. Ecclesia is not even a religious word. If you've ever been to a concert, you were in an ecclesia. If you've ever gone to a Broadway show, you were in an ecclesia. In some ways, you are in an ecclesia today, in more ways than one. It's a gathering of people that are following Jesus in such a way that they do their lives differently. That's what Jesus started. It's not a building for people. It's a body of people. And right then and there, everybody listening started to feel the mount of the temple shake. Because Jesus was going to bring it all closer. In fact, here's what's so interesting. If you remember from Easter all your life, when you've heard the story of Jesus' death, you might remember that when he dies, there's a curtain that tears. That curtain was located in the temple, the Old Testament temple, and it divided what was called the Holy of Holies from the rest of it. And you and me could never go in there. Only the high priest, because in the Holy of Holies was the presence of God. And when Jesus died, the curtain was torn, meaning the presence of God was no longer far off. You didn't need to go to a holy place and have a holy man. It was going to be totally new. In fact, Jesus would go so far as to say, I'm starting what he said was a new covenant. Just before his death, in the Last Supper, we talk about this all the time when we have communion here. These are the words that he said. This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. The seal on this deal was Jesus' death. That's how serious he was about it. Now, covenant is not a word we use a lot, right? You maybe heard it at a marriage ceremony where they were making a covenant with one another, but you don't go into a business deal and say, let's start a covenant, you and me, right? Like we just don't use that word a lot. And Jesus kind of expounds on it and says it's an agreement. You could think of it as an arrangement. But if we just boil it down to the nuts and bolts of what are we talking about when we talk about a new covenant or even an old covenant, we are talking about the way it works. How does this relationship with God work? Now, in the old days, here's how the relationship worked. There are rules. In fact, God gave more than 600 of them to people. And then he said, and here's the top 10. You really don't want to mess these up. And as long as the rules are obeyed and you check these off, then we're good. The problem is, people are no good at keeping just a few rules, let alone all of those. And so God decided we need a new covenant. There needs to be a new arrangement because I want a relationship with these people, but they keep getting in their own way. So I'm going to send my son, and we're going to start new. We're going to do this different. It's going to work different. And now the relationship with me is not going to be based on them. It's going to be based on him. And that changed everything. Now, some people, including back then and even now, go, okay, so should we just tear the Old Testament out of our Bible and throw that away and never read it again? Do the old rules matter at all? As Christians in the 21st century, should we pay attention to that? And Jesus had a really great answer to that question. This is what he said. Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish or do away with or pretend like that didn't exist. And I'm talking about the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. It's kind of a head-scratcher statement, right? What? Okay, Jesus, well, what do you mean? Think about the rules if you are a parent, grandparent, uncle, aunt, or you've babysat friends' kids. You give them rules, not because you just love giving them rules, but because you have an end in mind that you want to be true for them. I don't want them to get hit by a car. I don't want them to be electrocuted. I don't want them to steal things from their siblings. So you create some rules that are pointing forward to a behavior or a reality that you want to be true. Is it possible that Jesus is suggesting that all of the prophets and all of the law and all of what we would call the Old Testament, their purpose was not a bunch of rules. Their purpose was to point forward. If they were to shed light on who Jesus is. I dare you, if you are a Bible reader, to read through the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. And here's why I encourage you to do that. That's how all of his followers did it from the moment they met him on. Anytime Peter quotes the Old Testament, anytime Paul quotes the Old Testament, anytime Jesus quoted the Old Testament, it was all about, let me explain to you what that's really about. Jesus. It's all been pointing forward to this. This is why Jesus could say, all of the law and all of the prophets are summed up in one idea. Love God, love people. And the disciples still got that confused and still wanted to go back to the temple model. So then he said, I'm giving you a new commandment. You love people the way I love you. And here's the good news. If you love people the way I love you, the rules are not going to be a factor because you won't be violating any of them. Because they're all designed to make you do this. I came to fulfill. I came to do it perfectly. And your righteousness will be based on my doing them perfectly, not yours. Totally different dynamic. A brand new idea, but hard for the people of the institution. So Paul comes along, and I'm going to tell you what he said, because for some of us, you might be thinking, I'm crazy and I'm talking nuts up here. I want you to know, I just want to regurgitate what Paul has taught us. In a book that he wrote, a letter that he wrote, we call it Galatians, he says these words. Hold on, because it's intense. Let me put it another way. The law was our guardian until Christ came. It protected us until we could be made right with God through faith or through him. And now that the way of faith has come, we no longer need the law as our guardian. Oh, that didn't make people very happy. Because this was going to be uncomfortable. It was going to be messy, and we were going to lose some things that were familiar and comfortable and made us feel like this was serious and legitimate and that it mattered. And there's this whole part where, it's laid out in the Old Testament. What are we thinking? And Jesus would say, remember, I came to fulfill all of that. All of that can be summed up in the one commandment that I have given you. And this is how serious he was, how different the dynamic changed. Because he would go on to say something not long after this sentence that made everybody go, are you actually saying that a relationship with a person is more important than me coming to church? And Jesus would say, yeah. because these were his words. So if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, understand, everybody's still operating in that mode when Jesus is teaching this. So for you and I, we could kind of shift that to, if you're at church and you're singing the songs, I'm feeling good, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, pause there, because I want to make sure you understand this. He doesn't say if you suddenly remember that you did something wrong. He says if you suddenly remember that someone else has something against you, even though you thought you were right, even though you didn't say that, even though you didn't intend that, if you understand that somebody else has an issue against you, this is what he says to do. Leave your sacrifice there at the altar, go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your sacrifice to God. Can you imagine doing this? I try to put myself in this place. If I was sitting in one of these seats and the first song kicks off and I'm loving it, and then all of a sudden I'm reminded, oh, I know that so-and-so is angry at me. And you just leaned over your person and be like, I'll come back for third service, and you leave. And you call them, say, hey, can we get coffee? We need to make things right. You skip church to go make things right with a person. That's the new model. Because what Jesus would say over and over again, and what he's saying in this moment, is that your vertical relationship is now going to be measured by your horizontal relationships. In other words, your relationship this way is measured by your relationships this way. I know. All of a sudden, the new way doesn't sound so easy, does it? You're sitting there going, have you met the people in my life? They are not easy to get along with. And that matters. That matters in my relationship with God. In the new model, it does. You see, Jesus wasn't rearranging furniture. He started a new one, not a remodel. So here's what's so amazing about what Jesus did. And he would have this conversation with a woman at a well and countless other ones where the temple would come up as the place we need to go to connect with God. And Jesus would over and over again say, because we've come up with this new thing, that's not a holy place. You are the Holy One. Because my Spirit lives in you. Fitness influencers will talk about my body as a temple. They stole that idea, by the way, from Jesus. It's not so much about physical fitness. It's an understanding that the presence of God moved out of the temple and moved in with you. That you bring holy wherever you go when you have this relationship with Jesus. The important thing for you and me that we cannot miss in this new dynamic and the way we think about this is just like they did with the old model, with the old texts, you and I need to make everything we do about Jesus. This is about Jesus, not me. So, if there are things in your life that you are deciding to not do anymore, change your posture around it. So, stop thinking of it as, I've got to obey a rule or I'm going to have bad news. Start doing it because that's what Jesus did. And I'm trying to be just like him. So I'm going to try and give up gossiping. I'm not doing that anymore just because I want to be able to check a box and say I got a good grade. I'm not gossiping anymore because Jesus didn't gossip. And Jesus lived the best life possible, and his promise for me, what he wanted for me, was that he wanted to give me life to the fullest, so gossip's not part of it. Or if there are things you are doing now, do them because Jesus said so, or Jesus did so. Not because you're trying to check the box of I'm following rules. So an example here would be if you have decided to start giving to your church, don't do it because I asked you to, or because you're worried what other people are going to think. Do it because Jesus said, I love a joyful heart, which is, by the way, why we don't pass plates. Because we don't want to guilt you into giving. That's not what Jesus did. If you want to give, we got these things all over the place. You can drop it in there, and we so appreciate it and love you for it. But do that because Jesus invited you to live a generous life. And that's the kind of life that he lived, and that's life to the fullest. Now, I know, if you are like me, and you grew up like I did, you've been squirming a bit. Like this, again, feels irreverent, this feels irresponsible, this feels like we're throwing stuff out. Nobody's throwing anything out. We're just trying to understand it more deeply. And if you are someone that just can't let go of the things that allow you to know if you're getting a good or bad grade, I have some amazing and awful news for you. You already failed the test. And so did I. It's just, you're alive. You failed. But he offers a new way. And his way is our way to pass anyway. And that's why it's good news. Let's pray. And then I want to share something else with you. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for being you and knowing us so well and loving us so much. Thank you for all that's been so that we could fully understand and see the beauty of what has been given to us in Jesus. God, for those of us in this room that are struggling with letting go of what feels like a temple model kind of thing, will you give us the peace and the courage to lean into you? And for those of us that have been struggling with organized religion and we've been keeping it at arm's length for so long, help us to understand that the invitation is not back into that. It's into a relationship with you. And in the days ahead, weeks ahead, help us to be your ecclesia, your gathering of people. Help us to be the church wherever we go, representing you well. In Jesus' name, amen.